Before we get started, first off, thank you guys so much for finding the time to meet today. I know it was a bit late notice with that thing that was sent out last week, letting you guys know, and obviously we all have classes, so finding time to schedule, I know it's very difficult for a lot of us, and so thank you guys for taking the time to come here and meet and learn more about the new funding process. Brief introduction about myself. My name is Darren Trong. I'm the chair of the Ways and Means Committee, sophomore, and I'm studying civil engineering. So, brief breakdown for the table of contents for this presentation. I'm just going to be going through contact information and reminders, talk about the ad hoc process, as well as timelines, some stuff with equipment, and then alternative funding requirements. And then I'm also going to be talking about the upcoming SGA elections in terms of ballot options and how that affects RSO allocations. And then afterwards, we'll be going through the ad hoc guidelines, which are in the process of being finalized, but have not been finalized. And so most of what you see there is a pretty good expectation of what it's going to be expected of RSOs to submit. And then we'll have a Q&A at the end. Okay, so for contact information, if you guys ever need to reach out to me, please just shoot me an email, sgawaysmeans@umass.edu. Also CC my vice chair in case I miss an email. That way, hopefully one of us will see it. And then also, if you're ever wondering where to access the financial information, that's going to be on Campus Pulse homepage if you go under the campus links, and then it's going to be funding information. And that will bring you to a live Google document that has all the financial resources, applications, grants, etc. Another quick housekeeping, if you haven't already, please make sure your roster for your e-board members for your RSO and Campus Pulse is updated, just because the way we normally communicate with RSOs is we send out a campus relay, and so that sends out a notification to all the UMass emails that are listed for your RSOs, like officers that are listed on Campus Pulse. So if this isn't updated, then you guys may miss out on important information for finances and registry. Okay, so next I'm just going to give a brief introduction about what is the SATF, and then talk about the briefly general overview of the ad hoc funding process. So the Student Activities Trust Fund, or commonly abbreviated as the SATF, is basically a fund that supports all agencies, RSOs, as well as the student union renovations, which we are paying off until 2040. This is a fee that every undergraduate student here at UMass pays, and then it is allocated through the student government, which you guys elect representatives for. And so 186 of that goes towards the student organizations, such as yourselves, RSOs, as well as with the agencies, and then $100 of that goes towards paying off the student union, like I said, until 2040. And so some other, definitions and things to know. Title VI for our general bylaws, that just outlines our funding processes. And then the fee account, your RSO has a fee account and a revenue account. The fee account is for any sort of funding you guys receive from the SGA, and then your revenue account is going to be for any sort of funding that you guys get from outside sources. So this can be for fundraising, this can be from grants, etc. Okay. And then FY26, this is the term used to describe like this year, so fiscal year 26. It began last July and it continues up to this July. And then after July 1st, it will begin FY27. And then ad hoc, this is just like as needed on a rolling basis, and so the idea is, and I'll talk more about this in depth later, is you just be requesting the funding as you guys need it, as opposed to requesting everything 1 year in advance. Okay, so as I'm sure all of you guys are familiar with, we had across-the-board cuts last year, and so basically a quick rundown, because for some of you guys, maybe the first time you guys are seeing it, RSOs would request certain amount of money. They'd request more than we have on the SGA, and so in order to make sure that we don't over allocate and go into a deficit, we have to do cross-the-board cuts. And so for this past year, entering for your budgets this year, the cross-the-board cuts percentage was about 70%. And so out of the initial 7.8 requested by RSOs, after committee review, that went down to about 4.8, and then the final amount they were able to actually allocate to RSOs was about 1.36 million. And then line items is just like the specific number of things that RSOs are requesting. And then as you can see here, this is just the general graph in terms of our trending for revenues versus expenses. And so for revenue, that is the student activities fee that every student pays. And then the expenses, that's, as you can see, how much is being requested by RSOs and agencies. And then this is just the general trend graph in terms of the RSO budget cut percentage. So as you can see, there's a general trend that's increasing, and that's obviously a bad thing. So a general overview. So our previous budget process, RSOs would request 1 year in advance. Like I said, we would have more requests than we can give, so we'd have to do across-the-board cuts. And then one of the main issues is potentially with overinflation. So some RSOs figured out that if you request more than what you needed, or you requested more, you would get more money after the across-the-board cuts. And so that's like one of the main issues with our previous funding process, in addition to having to budget everything 1 year in advance. And so when you have those new e-boards rotating in, it's difficult to work with. So the new budgeting process, which we are moving forward with, is more, if you think of it like a grant process, so it's like first come, first serve. And so the idea is it's more flexible for like event planning and requesting things as you need it. And it's supposed to be a lot harder to overinflate your budget. And so the idea is we'll be able to allocate funding that RSOs are essential, funding that RSOs need so that they can carry out events that are essential to their mission statement. So the next section, I'm just going to go over timelines in terms of the upcoming budget deadline, talk about a little bit about equipment, and then talk about alternative funding requirements. So for the timeline, like I said, it's going to be processed on a first come, first serve, and so the budget deadline will be March 31st. This budget deadline is only for events, purchases, etc. that the RSO needs leading up to October 19th. Anything past October 19th, the RSO will be requesting in the fall. And so the way we're planning on doing the allocation, if you think of the RSO allocations as one big pool, is we're planning on having 40% of that be dedicated for requests in the fall semester and 60% being for the spring. The reasoning is, from speaking with RSOs and source, it seems like there are a lot more like larger events that require more resources in the spring. And so this is just to make sure that no matter what happens, we'll always have some sort of funding within the fall and spring semester. And then any sort of funding we don't use in the fall semester, that will roll over at the beginning of the spring semester. So the next thing in terms of this new budgeting process is we are moving forward with an equipment pause. And so I guess what we're defining as equipment is any non-expendable, non-clothing item that is standalone, movable, and externally visible with a life expectancy of over 2 years. The reason we have to go forward with this equipment pause that RSOs are purchasing is because the SGA, as required by university policy and state law, any sort of equipment that the RSO purchases with fee money, because it is a public fund that every student here is required to pay, we are required to tag and track all of the equipment that RSOs purchase with that fee money. And so we currently do not have the dedicated staff or personnel or process in place, and so that's why this equipment pause is being put into effect. And there'll be more clarifications on the next slide. Okay, so this is just a general breakdown of equipment that was requested from FY 23, 24, and 25. And then some FAQs. So does this pause apply to this year? No. So if your RSO requested funding for equipment last year and it was approved, you can still put in your PR request for equipment for this year. Can you still buy equipment with your revenue money? Yes. The pause on equipment purchases only applies to fee purchases, fee expenditures, fee requests, things that you're getting from the SGA. What are other ways my RSO can get equipment? So currently, W.E.B. Du Bois Library, they have a digital media library and circulation desk. They offer free resources and equipment for all UMass students to borrow. And then the last kind of FAQ is, how long will this pause remain in effect? There's no definitive timeline. However, I would say this pause will be in effect until we can establish the processes, and we're currently meeting within the SGA as well for stakeholders and student engagement leadership to establish a new process. And so I would say, at least for one academic year, this pause will probably be in place. And then I guess some clarification before I move on to the next section here. For example, if your RSO is requesting funding for a DJ, and then like in their contract, the DJ is like bringing equipment as part of their contract, that will still be valid and that is allowed because that is part of the DJ's contract and it's like rental. So the RSO, the pause only applies to equipment that the RSO is purchasing to keep in their inventory. That makes sense. Okay, the next section here is the additional funding requirements, and so if your RSO is requesting $15,000 or greater, or they have already been awarded like a certain amount, and then whatever they're requesting gets them above the $15,000, your RSO will be required to adhere to additional requirements, such as submitting an alternative funding plan, which would outline, for example, submitting your logistics plan or your outreach plan for those like larger events, as well as adhering to the alternative funding requirements, and I'll talk more about that on the next slide. But okay, so for this example, let's say your RSO has not requested anything for the year. They request $15,000. That either can be $15,000 all at once or up to $15,000 in smaller requests. And then they have not requested anything previously. And so the SGA would just be, assuming everything is approved through the funding guidelines, they would be giving you guys the $15,000. Okay, now let's say your RSO has already been awarded $15,000, either through one big request or a small request that up to the $15,000, and let's say your RSO wants to request an additional $1,000. Your RSO would be required to contribute $107.60 from the revenue account towards the event. So the SGA is not, we're not taking the revenue, it's just the RSO is contributing that towards the event, and then the SGA is considering $892.40. And so the reasoning behind this, and I can talk more about that when we get behind the slides, is we have a finite amount of resources and we want to have the request at $30,000 because based off the benchmarking, about 74% of RSOs requested under $30,000 from last year, and so that's why we want to accommodate for that $30,000. But at the same time, we do not have the financial allocations available to just be able to give out the $30,000. So the idea is, as you request closer to that $30,000, you'll be required to contribute more from your revenue account. And I will add a note that the percentage for what is expected for the RSO to contribute will directly vary depending on what happens with the upcoming ballot initiative that's coming up in the SGA elections, which I will talk more about in upcoming slides. Okay, so like I was talking about, when we were making this new funding process, what we did was we used data from the previous year for what RSOs requested, and so originally we were planning on having the cap at $15,000. Although as you can see here, we would only be able to support about 52% of RSOs and what they requested, and so obviously this is not an adequate amount, even when considering potentially overinflation of budgets, and so that's why we moved forward with the $30,000 proposal. And so as you can see here, about 74% of RSOs requested under the $30,000. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about the ballot initiative, but before I talk about that, I just want to preface, my job as the chair of the Ways and Means Committee is not to advocate for you guys to vote for any option. My job is not to advocate for you to vote for any candidate. My job is to give you guys the impartial data so you guys can make the informed decision as voters and as students. So, a brief history of the SATF. This is just how much we've raised the buy and when. And so we usually raise it every 2 to 3 years to keep up with inflation. And so last year was the exception. We increased it by $21 or 7.5% because we had a projected deficit of about $500,000. And so that raise was to offset it. And we've also raised it this year by the maximum we can, which is about $21, which I'll talk about more on the next slide. So, as I said, how often? We usually raise it every 2 to 3 years to keep up with inflation. Why we raised it, I just explained that. And so, why the SGA can't raise the fee without putting it on the ballot. The SGA, we are only allowed to increase it by 7.5% per year. Anything higher has to go to the student body for ballot referendum to either approve or disapprove or whatever numbers we're putting up there. And so the reasons that we raise it for the spring is because inflation, we're still behind on inflation when we're comparing our fee to what we have for the fiscal year 2019 for our fee, as well as additional mandatory salaries that have increased for like cost of living adjustments. And what those mandatory salaries are is, for example, is everyone here familiar with like UVC, Student Legal Services Office, UMass, EMS, those agencies? Yeah, they all have directors, and we're required to pay them like salaries and the cost of living adjustments. And so that has increased, and that's one of the reasons why. Another reason why is because we've increased in administrative overhead costs. So the SJ is responsible for covering that. One of the administrative overhead costs that we have been covering is, for example, all of you guys have your revenue counts for RSOs. Anytime you use your revenue count, there's a fee associated with that, and the SJ has been covering that fee for those transactions the RSOs have been doing with the revenue. So that way the RSOs can completely use any revenue that they generate without having to pay the fee associated with that. And so lastly, another reason for the increase was with our new agency funding process. And so as we're reforming the RSO funding process, we're also reforming the agency funding process. And so kind of the reasoning for this increase is obviously for you guys, if you're RSOs who host those large events or who need the support and the purchasing and et cetera, you guys can't conduct that without, for example, Source being able to function or UMass being able to function. And so part of this new agency level funding model is if we can support the agencies, they'll be able to support the students with opportunities and through other areas, as well as directly support RSOs through event hosting. And so what options are currently on the ballot? Currently we have on the ballot, and again, voting will open Monday, 5 p.m., and then it will close on Thursday, 5 p.m. And so we have the $25 per semester increase, $36 per semester increase, and then the $44 per semester increase. And then the direct implications of these ballots will be on the next slide. So I'll start from the bottom with option D. So option D is if none of these options combined get the 50%. And so what that will amount to is we will be forced to cut $500,000 worth of funding from RSOs for the aforementioned costs of the increased like salary, inflation, et cetera, that I mentioned on the previous slide. Emergency funding would remain at the $5,000, and so for those RSOs who are really reliant on travel for like competitions or whatever, we wouldn't really be able to adequately support you guys. And then DIA funding, I just put that in a caveat, that remains, we were by law mandated to fund that at $100,000. And so for option C, we have the $25 per semester increase, and so we would not be funding spring concert at all. And then we'd be able to provide the same amount of funding we're providing to RSOs right now. We'd be able to increase emergency funding from $5,000 up to $25,000. And then for option B, we have the $36 per semester increase. We'd be able to fund spring concert at $250. Caveat to that, that's not what they request, that's just the max we'd be able to provide to UPC. And then we'd be able to provide level funding to RSOs with potentially up to $54,000 increase for allocations. And this increase is basically, that's how much we've set aside for appeals for the agencies, and so all those appeals were to get denied, all of that $54,000 we've set aside would go directly back towards the RSOs. And then we have option A at the $44 per semester increase. So it's the spring concert, as I said, the increase in allocations from $4,000 up to $58,000, and then we'd be able to restore emergency funding back to what we had in FY25, which I believe was 2 or 3 years ago. And so that would really help out in terms of for this travel, and then we'd also be able to increase the DIA fund from $100,000 to $150,000 to that FY25 level. And so what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to open the floor for questions about anything in the presentation we've currently covered, and then after we conclude with that, I'll go through the funding guidelines and we'll have another Q&A session. And then we'll get the mic to you.
Hi. My question is, should the initiative fail for any reason, what is the plan? Is there a plan in place to limit the amount of funding that can be cut, or is the $500,000 automatic? Should the initiative fail, $500,000 gets cut immediately?
Yeah, so if the ballot fails, you would be short about $500,000, and so we've already cut pretty much whatever we can, like emergency funding, we've cut down to $5,000, and so in theory, I could go back into the bylaws and cut other stuff, or we could cut potentially other things, but this is really down to we've cut almost everything we can already technically. not sure, did I answer your question?
I just wanted to ask for like the $44 per semester increase. Does this come from like RSOs like increase, like having to pay $44, or is it from like the students?
This is, so all these ballot options relate to the student activities trust fund fee, and that's the fee that every single undergraduate student here at UMass is required to pay. And so even like if you're attending here for free, like the state is like footing the cost, so it's still getting paid.
Could you just talk about the voting process one more time? Who's allowed to vote? You said it starts on Monday, ends on Thursday. What's like the percentage of voters that you need to like get it passed? Yeah, if you could talk about
Happy to clarify. So voting opens on Monday at 5 p.m. and it closes, I believe, on Thursday at 5 p.m. This is done through Campus Pulse. Any member, undergraduate member of the student body can vote in these elections for the ballot. Could you repeat the second part of the question? I'm so sorry.
What if, like, SGA do need to kind of market this and like make sure? Because I feel like no one apart from the people in this room are going to know to vote. So, like, yeah, what can we do? What are you guys doing to make sure that like people know about this and are going to vote for it either way?
Yeah. So I guess to like my job is not to advocate for any like specific ballot. My job is to present information, and so what we're working on is like publicizing this information either today or tomorrow to get like on our Instagram. Right after these presentations conclude, I'll be sending out another campus relay that will go to all the RSOs with the presentation and the recording from UVC-TV. That will be attached to it as well. And then we're also, I know I have a meeting with all the agency directors tomorrow to communicate all of this on board in terms of what we're doing.
Voting is a yearly process. Like you vote every year for the president. I mean, you don't have to, but it's in your campus pulse, and it's yearly. You vote for the president. You vote for your senators who serve in the Student Government Association. If the SATF ballot fee increase is important to you, I would encourage you to encourage your RSO members, like the people in your organizations, to vote. You don't need to tell them to vote one way or the other, but you should encourage them to exercise their right to vote.
Hi, so for the options, is it made so that if you vote for like, for example, like option A and that one doesn't pass, would your vote be pushed down to B?
Yeah, so the way it would work is A, B, or C combined need at least like the 50%, like 50% 0.1 or whatever, to like have the majority. And then if we get that majority, whatever option has the most out of these three is what would pass.
Okay, gotcha.
I was just wondering, is this just one ballot, or do we have to encourage our members to vote for every aspect of the SGA election, or just this fee increase one?
Yeah, happy to clarify. So when voting opens on Campus Pulse, like you'll have the options to vote for the trustee, president, senators, whatever. You don't have to fill any of those out. So if the only thing that matters to you is the ballot, you can really just sign in, go to the ballot, and then submit it.
So let's say my club is planning to go to a conference in the fall, and we usually plan for it in the spring, so the summer before. So it would get pulled from our fall finances, but we can request it in the spring still for the price it was at the spring.
So I'm not sure I completely understand.
So we plan for a conference in like November, like the conference happens in November, and we take like 15 or so members of our club based on our mission statement, and like that's what we've been doing for the past like, I don't know, 10 years or so. But we plan for it in March, April, May around. So because we're able to usually book these flights, hotels 6 months in advance, it's usually way cheaper. So you're saying that are you saying that we're able to pull from funds in the fall at the prices in the spring, or we have to request it at the prices in the fall during the fall? Does that make sense?
I'm not sure entirely understand. I'll try.
So, for example, like if you book a flight in May and you want to go in November,
Correct.
it's cheaper in May,
Correct.
but that's during the spring semester.
Yes.
So do I have to request it at the price in November?
It would be at the price at the time that you're submitting your budget request.
So if I submit it in May or March or April or whatever,
Yeah.
is that taking from my fall budget or my spring budget?
So the upcoming deadline for this March is only for events up until October 19th. And so if you had an event next spring, then you'd be requesting for that in the fall. And so that would count towards your like RSO's cumulative $30,000 budget request. But where that $30,000 or however much is actually being requested would pull from would be out of that larger pool what we've allocated for the spring semester.
I don't think I'm understanding your answer. So you're saying, so if my conference is usually in like November, then I have to request it at November prices because it's after the October 19th deadline?
Since it's after the October 19th deadline, you wouldn't be requesting that for this upcoming deadline. You'd be requesting that in the fall.
Okay, so then we would have to request at the more expensive prices, is what you're saying?
Yeah, unfortunately, at least for this year, that is how the process is going to work. And so this is kind of a trial run because we have to work through this new system. And so hopefully in the next year, we'll be able to have a system so that RSOs can request for travel this spring for those events in fall. But for this year, unfortunately, we're not able to carry that out just due to the timeline that we currently have left.
Okay, that clarifies things.
I have a couple questions. First, so what do you expect the across-the-board cuts to be for the coming 26-27 year, given this new system?
Yeah, so this new system, we will not be having across-the-board cuts. So in the old system, you request your budget, and then at the end of the year, you have cuts because people are requesting more than we have. In this new system, we're moving to, if you think of it more like a grant application based, and so you just be requesting it as you need it, and then we'd be approving it weekly, going and reviewing the request weekly. And so the trade-off is there's no across-the-board cuts in this new system, but obviously we have a finite amount of funds, and so there is the possibility that we run out of funding depending on how much is being requested by RSOs and when they're requesting it.
Okay, so if you request 10K and you fit all the requirements over the fiscal year, would you expect that you would get that 10K in general?
Yeah, once you're allocated that 10,000, there are no across-the-board cuts. So that's the finalized amount.
Okay. Then my second question is, in terms of documentation for budget requests, if your club is purchasing from, say, a student vendor, what would documentation of price look like? Especially if you expect to buy the items in the fall, in September?
Yeah. I would say the documentation would likely look like either some sort of invoice or a menu or some sort of outside documentation. In terms of specifics, I would just reach out to the student business you're working with and reach out to your source advisor.
Okay, thank you.
What is the process going to look like of actually using the money once you're approved for it? You submit the budget request and then you have to do another request, or can you just use it?
Yeah, happy to clarify. So what we originally aimed for was to have a unified process and merge the budget process and the purchase request process. However, due to some technical difficulties, we will not be able to implement that for this spring, and so that's something that's probably going to be implemented moving forward over the next year or so, hopefully. And so what it would look like currently is you request the funding, you get the funding, and then you'd have to go through source and cycle finance to submit that PR process, which is currently what you guys do.
I had two questions. One of them is that $30,000 cap, is that the amount requested or is that the amount allocated by SGA? And then my follow-up is, if you exceed that cap, will we just have to fundraise from our revenue account directly, or is there kind of another process for that?
Yeah, excellent question. So the 30,000 is the request amount that's being capped, and then if an RSO requires additional funding outside of 30,000, the SJ would not be considering it. However, RSOs potentially, depending on what they're requesting for, could go through emergency funding or through the DIA fund. And I know we're also working on the process of setting up a grant system to assist RSOs with finding grants and helping them with applying for grants as well.
So just to clarify, if we request, for example, 5,000 for the, or let's say 10,000 for the fall up to the October 19th deadline, but then we only get approved 7,000, for our request for the later periods, do we get 10,000 deducted from that 30,000 pool, or just the 7,000 that we received? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it would just be the 7,000 because that's what you were approved for. The only time we'd be considering multiple requests is if you submitted like 5,000 requests like at the same time in queue, and that's what we would.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, so I just have a couple questions. Is there any estimate when the equipment requirements will be lifted? Because like, if we want to get something before October 19th, I would hope that the requirements lifted before March 31st, but do you have an estimate on when that will be?
Yeah, I would assume that we're not going to be able to lift the equipment pause for at least 1 year. That would be my assumption.
Second thing is, there was no mention of anything like bus tickets under travel expenses. Will we be able to ask for funding for bus tickets as well?
I believe bus tickets would fall. Sorry, but it would probably fall under other forms of transportation.
Cool, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question about equipment. So I saw the equipment restriction, but when I looked up at what the library you can like borrow, you can only really borrow like handheld mics. And at least for RSO, like we have like worship music every week, which then means we need a full speaker system, we need a sound system, XLR cables, and mics, and ours are deteriorating and we need to get new ones because otherwise we can't do that. So what's the regulation on that? Because although you have an equipment restriction, the equipment we can borrow doesn't cover everything we need.
Yeah. So I would say, in terms of purchasing with fee money, that is something that unfortunately we have to implement because we as the SJ are liable if any equipment with fee money goes missing and we haven't been tracking it. And so that's obviously an issue that started before my time, but that's something that we have to unfortunately put a pause on. I will say that you have the W.E.B. Du Bois catalog, and then there's also the option potentially of looking at other resources on campus, and then that option with the RSO revenue account as well.
Yeah, just kind of a follow-up question with that is like, you know, if we have a 60-person meeting, we're not going to fit in a sound room at W.E.B. Du Bois, and that's the only place that would have the proper equipment for this. So you're essentially saying we have to just like acoustic everything.
I mean, unfortunately, we just can't allow RSOs to purchase like the equipment because if that goes missing, then it's a violation of university policy and state law, and so we have to be compliant with that. We haven't been compliant with that, but that's something that we have to be moving forward.
How are you allocating money for clubs that use like materials throughout the course of the semester or the school year for a like specific project?
In terms of materials for projects, that's still allowed. The restrictions in terms of that would be like if you're using materials to build like capital infrastructure, like a cabin or something, that's like where the restriction would come into play.
But like, how would we go about requesting that money? Because everything that was talked about was for events. We need to do the like debrief after the event, and the requests are for specific events. So how would you be treating individual material costs?
In terms of when requesting materials, based off your RSO's mission statement, I'm assuming you just put that under the general RSO supplies template. And then for the post-event like auditing and documentation requirements, which I think that's what you're referring to, that would only apply for like those large like events, and so that doesn't apply to like materials and stuff. If that makes sense.
And for the debate team, a problem that we've run into in the past is that we're going to tournaments at other universities, and oftentimes they don't provide us with like pricing or how much like we owe them for going to the tournament more than 21 days in advance for the like funding process. So would it be acceptable to, for instance, like when we're making our initial funding request, say like this is how much it cost us last year as an estimate, and then if we later on it ends up being slightly less, we would then return funding, and if it ends up being slightly more, like we would use our revenue count. Is that how that would work?
Yeah, 100%. For those like events, such as you mentioned, but also for example, like university vendors like UMass, UMPD, they may not necessarily have invoices, and so like if you have invoices from last year, those generally speaking like stay the same, and so we would accept that as sufficient documentation.
All right, thank you.
Hi, I just wanted some clarification on the unspent funds thing you brought up earlier. Like your example was, if you used if you requested and got 5,000 and you only used 4,000, you mentioned that you wouldn't be able to use that like extra 1,000 towards a different project. Is there any reason for that? Like, because like if you go under budget, you wouldn't be able to use that money.
Yeah, happy to clarify. So the reasoning for that is because that $5,000 is what's been requested by the RSO. It's what's gone through source and the committee and then cycle finance. So it's been like verified, and it's like, for example, if you have money for grant money, like you can only use it for that purpose. And if you have extra, you have to return it or whatever the stipulations for the grant. And so that's like the same logic with these funds.
Okay, so like you wouldn't like if you were requesting for something else, you wouldn't be able to like report, oh, we still have this 1,000. And you wouldn't be able to use that towards the next project?
The 1,000 would first be rolled back to the SGA, and then that would go to the pool amount. And then based on where your request is in the queue, that could go like directly back to you guys, or that could go back to another RSO.
All right, so I mean, it just seems like it's kind of like, if we got that money, like, then we have to return it, and then we might not get that money back for the next project.
That is correct. Yes. That's the same thing with grant funding.
All right.
So I have a question. So that you've been mentioning before that if you have unspent funds, then you return it to the SGA. Can you elaborate on what that would look like in the process for that?
Yeah, of course. So all you'd have to do is you'd email Jan Cole, who's in Cycle Finance, and then you would CC myself, my vice chair, and then Michelle, who's the SATF advisor, and then they would make the actual transaction on their end, and then they would send you guys like a screenshot for documentation. And so the next time your RSO requests, you would just submit that documentation to us. The reason we do that is just because we don't want to run into a scenario where we're like over allocating, so that's why we have that verification step.
I just have a question about the first come first serve process and when that starts. Like, are you expecting? I guess like now with the March 31st deadline, do you just submit a budget? Like, is it already rolling the first come first serve?
Currently, the form is not open. When we finalize the form and publish it, there will be another campus relay sent out, and then it will be open to the public. So no one's going to have like a leg up in terms of when the form is open.
And so when that opens, it's going to be like thousands of requests, and then there's just a massive queue. And then, like during the semester, is there even a point in submitting another form, or is it kind of too late to get budget?
Yeah. So with our allocation split, we're doing the 40% in the fall sem and 60% in the spring. And so even if we run out in the fall, we'll still have the 60% available in the spring. And even in the fall, for example, if all the RSOs requested all of the spring allocations in the fall, but we don't use all of the fall money, all of that fall money will go over at the beginning of the spring semester, so we'll have some sort of funding at the beginning of the spring semester. So there are some, I guess, checks in place in terms of trying to make sure we have some sort of funding available for each semester. end of the day, it comes down to how much is in that large pool, which I can talk more about when we get to the ballot questions.
And one quick follow-up, is it possible to get any funding for this semester, or is it kind of, like, is the form gonna open up within, like, a couple weeks, a month?
Yeah, so the request, the budget deadline in March is for events and purchases, etc., in the summer and fall, up to October 19th. So in terms of funding for this year, if your RSO needs funding right now, if you're a new RSO, you can go through startup funding process. We got 2,000 that's allocated, and then in terms of emergency funding, we have 3,000 if it's like an unforeseen circumstance. I will disclose, however, we do have a queue of requests already, and we only have 3,000. And so I believe we have about 1,200 left. Leo can correct me because he's the chair of the finance. 1,100.
Okay, perfect, thank you.
I'm going to take a couple more questions, and then I'm just going to go back to the ballot stuff because that is really important. I want to make sure everyone here is aware of that.
Just a quick clarifying question here. I think I remember the lodging was $110 max per person per room. I wanted to know if there was any exemptions, or was that just complete maximum?
That would be the maximum per person.
All right, thank you.
I'm going to take 2 more questions.
So based on the current system, my understanding is that inevitably there comes a point where organizations are not capable of requesting funding. How much money do you think we should have on hand in revenue accounts to support ourselves through that inevitable situation? And also, how are you planning on supporting organizations in that context?
Yeah, of course. I answered the second part of the question. It was last Monday. We just started up a new subcommittee on the Ways and Means, so it's the Financial Policy Reform Subcommittee. One of their main goals is to create a centralized list of grants for RSOs, host grant workshops, and help RSOs apply for that. And so that's something we're hoping to start up within the next year. There's some other initiatives that they're also working on, such as like an endowment initiative to diversify their sources of funding. But again, that's going to take years out from now. And in terms of how much revenue RSOs are expected to have, I guess that just really depends on what the RSOs are requesting for, and so I guess I can't really. I'd have to know like the RSO specific needs in order to answer that.
It seems to me that the thing that a lot of people are worried about is that that 40% for the fall semester would run out very quickly, given that I think it said the SGA doesn't have that much money to give out, and it's $15,000 per club. Every club's not going to be able to get $15,000. So, is the SGA's policy there that it's just going to be will there be any adjustments to the cap if it seems like the money is going to run out very quickly, or would it just be if we run out of the 40% cap a month or 2 into the semester, and then after that it's just for any events in the second half of November and December, you just have to pay for it out of your revenue cap?
I can say the cap thing is definitely something we're looking into. What I will say is the percentage for requests above the $15,000 for the alternative funding requirements, that percentage for how much RSOs are going to be expected to contribute will depend directly on the ballot, which I will get to right after this question. Okay, if there are no further questions, I'm going to move on to go into the ad hoc funding guidelines. So, brief overview of the ad hoc funding guidelines. So, just general information. March 31st, that's the budget deadline, and that's for anything the RSO needs up from July 1st up until October 19th. Anything past October 19th, again, the RSO will be requesting in the fall semester. RSOs are capped at requesting the $30,000 per fiscal year, and then previously granted plus the cumulative requests. Any requests over the $15,000 will be subject to the alternative funding requirements and funding plan. Like I said, that percentage for how much we're expecting for RSOs to contribute is directly tied to the upcoming elections for the ballots, like I said. Another key note of the ad hoc funding guidelines, any sort of unspent funds that are previously approved are automatically factored towards your next request. So for example, if your RSO requests $5,000 for event A and they only use $4,000, that extra $1,000 cannot be used for like event B because that's not what it's been approved for. If you think of it like grant money. And so when the RSO is requesting additional funding, if they don't want that extra $1,000 to be considered, they would just have to reach out to Jan Cole and Cycle Finance and then CC myself and Michelle. And then Cycle Finance would move that $1,000 back to the SGA and then we would not consider it. The reason we have this verification is just to make sure we're not over allocating the money we have so we don't go into like a deficit. And then the last thing is certain invoices may be required to be submitted separately. This is a Cycle Finance policy. So I can talk more about that. But if you scan the QR code, that will bring you to the current funding guidelines. And then I'm going to, once people like scan it as they need it, I'm going to switch over to that tab and we'll go through the guidelines. Okay. So some quick terminology. So anything the RSO is like individually requesting, that's like referred to like as the line item. And then all of your line items combined, that is called like the budget request. And so you're going to hear that referred to throughout this document. So like on the slides, the application window is submitted on a first come first served basis with applications for anything the RSO needs up until October 19th, being due on March 31st. The allocation pool will be out of what we have to allocate to RSOs. 40% of that will be for the fall semester, 60% will be for the spring. Any funding from the fall semester that doesn't get used, that will roll over at the beginning of the spring semester. And then like I mentioned, for the funding cap, each RSO may request up to $30,000 per fiscal year. Other forms such as DIA funding, emergency funding from the SJ will not be considered towards the funding cap. And then for requests that have previously been granted or requested cumulative sum of greater than $15,000, your RSO has to submit an alternative funding plan as well as contribute the percentages from the alternative funding calculator as I showed earlier on the Google Sheet. Okay, and then this is just a general breakdown of the process and timeline. So first, the RSO would just submit it to source. That will get evaluated by their undergraduate staff, and if it's for a more complex event, that will be sent over to the advisor for approval. And then after all of that is submitted and they check for all their source requirements, such as submitting like in advance, compliance with university policy, etc., that will be forwarded by the advisor to the SGA. And so the SGA Ways and Means Committee will just be meeting weekly and we'll be reviewing that on a first come, first served basis based on like the timestamp that it's been sent to us. And so once the request has been reviewed, there are a couple options the RSO has. So if there are any adjustments that the committee makes, we give the option if the RSO wants, we can send it back to the RSO to amend and make any changes rather than outright denying the request. We also have the option if the RSO is fine with the decisions made, we can just send it to Cycle Finance to allocate the funds. And then if your group feels that they've been discriminated against because of their viewpoint, for example, if I'm a Democrat, she's a Republican, I can't like veto her funding request because she's from UMass Republicans, because that's considering your group's viewpoint. So that's an example of like a grounds for appeal. Another example would be like if we meant to fund you at $100 and we accidentally made like a calculation error and put in 10, that would be another example of what could be approved. And so that would just go to the Administrative Affairs Committee and they would go through their processes for appealing that. Okay, and then once Ways and Means approve it, Cycle Finance will move the funding and then the RSO will execute through the current PR process. And so hopefully over the next year or so, we're working with admin, we'll be able to combine the PR process and the budget request process into one unified process. But as of yet, we have not been able to complete that. So the purchasing process will remain the same once allocations have been given. And then post-event, there'll just be a form that RSOs will have to submit if you're hosting like a large event within 21 days of that event happening. And that would just be like the logistics plan, but if anything changed from what you initially accounted for, and then like attendance records, that sort of thing. And then chapter 3 here, we're just going through eligible requests. And so one of the few good things that we heard from last year was templates, and so that's something we've expanded to hopefully help RSOs. The idea behind the templates is basically they'll have all the information that the committee will be using to evaluate your funding request, and so as long as you fill out that template and you input the information, then you should be getting the full money that you guys are requesting. And then a more general note, I will say with these guidelines, we've tried to make them more concise and shorter. I know the page, it says 20 pages, but the actual stuff that you guys will need to read will be about 17 to 18 pages, give or take. And then this is the purchasing rules that Saco Finance Purchasing Office has in terms of with the invoices, and so that's just been pasted on here so that we're consistent with Saco Finance Purchasing. So this could be a general idea of what is required by an RSO. For example, general RSO supplies. We would just need to know why the RSO is requesting it, how it's essential to the mission statement, and then the quantity. And then I will note for the cost breakdown, for example, if the RSO forgets to label cost breakdown, or they make a computation error, or it's not super clear, we're not going to be penalizing RSOs for that sort of formatting. The cost breakdown is purely to help the committee, because we go through like every single line item. It's just to help us do the math quicker. And so if there's like a mistake on the RSO side, we are not going to penalize you guys for any mistakes in the cost breakdown. Although it would be nice if it was accurate, because that would help us review it. And then for evidence, it just has to originate from an outside source and prove the unit cost or total cost. So for example, if you were buying 1 pack of markers, you could just provide a screenshot from like Amazon that says it's $5.99, or if you're requesting 2 markers, for example, and it's $11, you could just provide evidence that also shows it's either like the $11 the total cost or the unit cost, whichever your RSO has. Okay, and then for next one, we just have equipment. So we define this as I said, any non-expendable clothing item that is standalone, movable, and externally visible with a life expectancy of over 2 years. And then there are the equipment pods that we mentioned, and so in order for equipment to be purchased, it would have to meet the exemptions listed in this bookmark, which we will be going through after we go through the templates. And then with clothing, this is similar to last year. Just a reminder, any sort of clothing and RSO purchases, it has to be like tracked and cataloged. And then it also has to be non-personalized. So for example, if I'm an RSO and I'm requesting money for like a hoodie, it can't have like my name on it. Like it can have the RSO's name, but it can't have like my personal like e-board name on that. And then university services, this is a new template created. It's just meant to cut down on the amount of information we're requiring if it's like a mandatory service, like UMPD, UMass, EMS, those E&H, health and safety, like those things that RSOs like need for those large events. And then extra professional services, this is pretty much the same as last year. Non-student payroll, the only student payroll that we will be funding with fee money will be for like coaches. So for example, if you're like karate club and you need like a coach to help train up for a competition, that would be an example of something that would be valid under this non-student payroll. Anything else, we're not going to be providing any sort of funding with fee money for student payroll. And then we've delineated and expanded from last year in terms of food. So now we have light refreshments, which are like, you know, your chips and prepackaged snacks. You have your meals and catering, and then you have your ingredients as well, if you're doing cooking or whatnot. And I will say, as we're going through, you may notice that some of these line items are like capped at a certain amount per person. If you're curious how we got to that amount, at the bottom of the funding guidelines, there's a benchmarking label, and that has all the information that we use to determine the caps that we are determining for these line items. And then for conferences, events, and competitions, I will say the biggest change from last year, because we've heard a lot from RSOs, is last year we did not fund a lot of these conferences because we said they were private events. And so this year we've added an exception. So even if it's a private event for a conference, we are still allowing RSOs to request for that. As long as they can prove that that's like essential for your mission statement, then we will be approving and granting that exception for the private events, for the conferences and competitions and events. Okay. And then so for flights, as you can see here, there's a cap up to $460 per person per event for domestic flights. Basically, what I did is I just went on the US.gov website and I just calculated the median amount that it would cost to travel within the US. It was like $457, so I just rounded up to $460. So that's how we got to that cap number. And then so for rental vehicles, this is pretty much the same as last year in terms of other forms of transportation. For gas, we are switching it up. So previously, RSOs would request for gas money, and we'd reimburse on like the cost per gallon of gas. This year, we are moving to the IRS standard mileage reimbursement, same thing like the federal government uses, and so we'll be reimbursing at 70 cents per mile traveled by like the RSO, like if you were driving a car. And then we have lodging expenses here. That's capped at $110 per person per night in terms of what can be requested. So if your RSO requested like $150 per person, we would just adjust that down to $110. And then chapter 4, we're just going through in terms of the ineligibility and adjustments. So like I said, if your RSO requests for something that's capped and it's above what's that cap limit, instead of like denying it, the committee would just adjust it down to whatever that cap is. And so to clarify, if your lodging is like $150 and your evidence shows $150, the committee will adjust it down to like $110 as the cap, but the evidence is still sufficient because that is like verifying what the cost is. And then for this section, these are things that the committee will deem ineligible. So ineligible means you can't use fee money. It would have to be like with revenue money. And so any line item that we can't determine meets like the information requirements. And so for example, if you were to submit to us a request and you didn't include evidence, that is something that may be denied and deemed ineligible by the committee because we can't verify the actual cost of the item that you, or item, etc. that your RSO is requesting for. And then obviously we have the stuff with like state law, federal law. RSOs can't request for that, alcohol, tobacco, illegal substances. One thing I wanted to note is RSOs, you guys are exempt from mass sales tax. So if you're putting in requests for funding, just make sure you're not including the sales tax in whatever you guys are requesting. And then the next section here, as I mentioned previously, like with that equipment template, these are some of the things that in terms of the equipment requirements that would be deemed eligible. So stuff used for like capital improvement, construction, renovations, physical infrastructure, that sort of thing. Anything that can be provided for free by on-campus. So for example, if you're requesting stuff to print, like for printer paper, that stuff you can get from the source for free. They provide 25 free copies per RSO per week. They also do color print. And then 2.7.2 here, this is the equipment that I was talking about. And so some of the things included would be like computers, laptop, keyboards, etc. Full list is like linked there. And so anything you guys can get for free, you can just borrow it as UMass students for free. And so we're not going to be funding that with fee money. And then for the equipment, to wrap it up, any sort of equipment that cannot be stored securely poses significant safety liability risk, requires liability coverage, specialized training, and cannot be used for another reoccurring event relevant to your RSO's mission statement. It doesn't have a lifespan of at least 2 years. That will also be deemed ineligible. Okay. And then 2.16, like I said, with the private events, we have that exception for those like private conferences and events, as long as your RSO can prove why it's essential to their mission statement and beneficial to the campus community. And then a big one from last year, especially like with travel, as you may have noticed, there are a lot more new requirements for travel and lodging. And so if you are requesting for that, please make sure you just double check the templates and the ineligible. So if you have any questions, just shoot me an email or send me anytime. Always happy to meet. And so some of the things that will be ineligible is any sort of tickets that are not economy class, or if the committee cannot determine our economy class. So any sort of first class, coach, business class tickets, we would not be funding them. Any sort of funding that we can't justify, if the RSO can't justify why they need to travel X amount of days in advance. So for example, if your RSO is trying to get to a competition and you request for flights 1 month in advance, you are required to submit or justify why you need the flight tickets 1 month in advance as opposed to like a week in advance. And that's just so we can evaluate if it's an effective use of our fee money. And then the next section here, this stuff is just stuff that SACO Finance doesn't allow anyway, so we just added it in here to keep consistent. So like cancellation penalties, prepaid fuel, Uber, and then the full list is linked here. Okay. And then allocations, which I think I went over already. And then the post-event documentation. Again, this is like for those events within like 21 days. You just have to fill out a Google form with like your attendance and like did anything change from what you planned, etc. And then this is the benchmarking that we've used in terms of when creating these guidelines. So that's everything in the ad hoc funding guidelines. So I'm going to open up the floor for questions. If you guys have questions, we'll just have the mic passed around.
So it says we can't use funds for like payroll for students. Can we like pay students as like performers at like a musical event?
Any sort of payroll for students with fee money is not allowed unless it's for like that coach example that I mentioned.
What would be the difference like with say the coach example versus something like unacceptable? Oh, okay. Yeah.
You mentioned a cap on the domestic flights, but for international flights, was there a cap that you had mentioned that I missed by any chance?
There's no cap on international flights. That's just because it varies too much based on like global events and stuff. And so the only cap, or the only limitation the RSO would have would be that like $30,000 cap, which applies to all of RSOs.
Thank you.
You mentioned that the deadline is March 30. So is it deadline to put all of our purchase requests for till October 19th, or is it like a budget request for all those events?
Yeah, happy to clarify. So the budget request is due on March 31st. This is for anything that RSO needs up until October 19th. And so we haven't completed the process of merging the budget request and the purchase request process. So once you get that allocation, you'll still have to go through the separate process of making the purchases.
I wonder when would be the next deadline for for whatever events that occur after October 19th? Because what if our event is just a couple days after that date? How could we get the money to fund that? Yeah.
Yeah, happy to clarify. So the reason we have the October 19th is because my term as chair ends in May, and so there'll be a new chair coming in over the summer. And so it's very impractical during this transition period because the chair is transitioning, but also because we may not have enough actual like Senate members to vote and review budget requests over the summer. And so that's the reason we have that like October 19th. But anything after October 19th, it would just be like we would submit it and then we would just review it as we get the requests. If that makes sense. So there wouldn't be any like hard deadline after October 19th. You just submit it as you need it.
Sorry, so then the whatever events that occur after October 19th, you would just submit event by event, or you would submit a big budget request for all events that would happen after that?
I guess that's in preference to your RSO in terms of what they want to do, if they want to submit it as they get the information, or they want to do it all as one big request.
One more question. For the budget that we already have in our fee account now, would there be any change made to that?
Yeah, so the money that RSOs have in their fee account for this year, you guys have it up until, I'm not 100% sure, but Source has like a deadline from when the last PR can be put in. And so I'd reach out to your advisor to make sure if you need to buy anything, you're buying anything before that deadline. And then at the end of the fiscal year on July 1st, any money that's not spent from RSOs, any agencies and the SGA, et cetera, will all roll back and carry over for next year.
So I'm pretty sure you said that you couldn't make any requests for like infrastructure improvements, but if a club is contingent on like kind of acts of civil service, infrastructure repair, what would that look like? So does that just mean we have to find funding elsewhere for things like that, like materials for, say, like a pipe that burst that this community needs help repairing or something like that?
I'd have to check the guidelines, but based off what you've described, I don't think that would be eligible under the requirements for the guidelines. Yeah, so to clarify, that would not be eligible.
Hello, I just have two questions. So the first question kind of being like, how far in advance, so the first deadline obviously is for October and stuff like that, but let's say for the fall you do have that event that's October 22nd or something like that. How far in advance should you be doing the budget request to ensure that you get the money in time? And also, what do you think would be the potential turnaround from submitting a budget to then hearing that you got approved, and when would that money be deposited into the student's fee account?
Yeah, definitely. I think in terms of the turnaround, it really depends on how long Source and Sacco Finance takes. On the SGA side, which I can speak to, that'll probably take between a week and a half, depending on like when that request is submitted versus like if all the RSOs are submitting at one time, there's going to be like a queue compared to like if we have gaps in terms of when RSOs are submitting. And then in terms of like requests specifically after the October 19th, if it's right after, one of the possibilities that we are working with, unfortunately, just based off the time constraints that we have, is that event may have to be like rescheduled to a time further down the line so that request can be processed.
I was just wondering if you could clarify something for me. I'm from the outing club. We have a cabin. You're telling me that, and we maintain it, that's our responsibility, we're the stewards of it. You're telling me that if there's a broken pipe and it's leaking out, we're not able to use fee money to repair that. We're not able to make improvements with fee money. We're not able to do anything with the fee money to maintain that space that is accessible to the whole UMass community.
Yes, that would be correct. We're not allowing fee money for those like capital improvements. And I believe, to my knowledge, the cabin is owned by UMass, I believe. So.
And it's maintained and managed by the outing club.
Correct. Yeah, and so it's definitely a conversation I think that needs to happen between not only between us, like SJ and UMass, but also with administrators to work on an agreement that best works out for all the parties involved.